Thank you for joining us for another one of our conversations on COVID-19. We have been talking to our colleagues here and abroad and asking them how this pandemic affected their work and their lives. Today, we have the director of University of Washington's Human Rights Center, Professor Angelina Godoy, with us. Human Rights Center has been an important part of the Jackson School for the past 10 years. After conducting a number of very important research and work on Central and South America, Professor Godoy has been leading a new effort in Human Rights Center, which is titled Human Rights at Home. Professor Godoy, thank you for joining us. Can you tell us at first what human rights at home means and what are some of the works that you've been involved in under this rubric?
Thank you for having me, Professor Kasaba. So we've been working on this project, which we call Human Rights at Home, since early 2017. And the way it began is really in response to increasing calls that we received from our colleagues here in the Puget Sound area for assistance in responding to a range of concerns that included a rise in hate crimes, in anti-immigrant sentiment, Islamophobia, and other troubling developments that seem to begin or maybe not begin, but accelerate throughout late 2016 and then begin in 2017 to continue. At that time, we weren't focused specifically at the Center for Human Rights. We weren't specifically focused on conducting research in that area. But as you know, our mandate, which is given to us by the Washington State Legislature, is to work hand in hand with frontlines human rights advocates. So whether that means grassroots organizations working in local communities or, policymakers or professional advocates working for human rights, the goal of our center is to conduct the research that enables them to be more effective advocates or policymakers or otherwise contribute to an improvement in real-world human rights. And the mandate given to us by the legislature is extraordinarily broad. We're asked to work on all different human rights issues in all different parts of the world. And so up till around then, we had done one project working with local immigrant rights group One America, which focused on human rights concerns in immigration enforcement along the northern border between Washington State and Canada. But immigrant rights in particular hadn't been a central focus, I guess I would say, of our work. But then as we started to receive more and more statements of concern and requests for assistance from partner organizations here in the Puget Sound area in early 2017, we realized, if we're a Center for Human Rights worthy of the name, we have to find a way to step up to this urgent challenge. And the urgency of the requests we were receiving was really, really impactful. And so although we didn't have a grant, excuse me.
That's all right.
Why don't you have that banana that's there? Sorry. We didn't have yes. So although we didn't have a grant set aside to fund this particular area of work, we thought, we had to find a way to make it happen. And, we've been very scrappy since our beginning. We were never founded we were funded actually as an unfunded mandate. So we thought this is nothing new. We've got to step up to the challenge. And so we decided to call this area Human Rights at Home because, as I said before, we were receiving a range of requests for different types of human rights assistance. But we thought sort of one area of a point of attack of these problems might be focusing on immigrant rights in our state and the way that was being impacted by growing federal immigration enforcement. And so that's the focus of what we do now. Of course, we do hope, I shouldn't say this is the focus of everything we do at the center, but it's the focus of our Human Rights at Home project, which has since we began it in 2017, really grown by leaps and bounds. And we continue to think it's extraordinarily important, and we hope to both deepen that engagement, but also if we had more resources, we would love to expand it to other areas of human rights at home. So it wasn't only looking at immigrant rights, but labor rights, environmental rights, and all other types of human rights issues that are pressing right here in Washington State.
I know you've been quite busy in the last, I think perhaps almost 2 years now, dealing with these issues, especially the immigrant and refugee rights. Can you tell us how this pandemic and all the restrictions that came with it affected that work?
Well, I guess I would say it's affected it in a number of ways. Some of it has nothing unique to us, but it makes all of our work a little bit more challenging to figure out how to do it digitally, to not be able to meet in person. For those who are doing direct work, for example, concerns about conditions at the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma, the ability to go in and actually visit the facility was a very important way to maintain the flow of information, and that's not available now in the context of the pandemic. So those are challenges that have arisen in light of what's happening with coronavirus. But I would say maybe more urgent than the question of how it impacts our work is how it impacts the human rights conditions that we're trying to look at. And I would say there, at least in the area of immigrant rights, it has made so much clearer that many longstanding concerns that we had about inequalities or injustices happening in Washington state as a result of the way in which immigration law is being enforced in the state, many of those have now become that much more urgent because they literally are becoming, in some cases, life and death questions about if a person is detained and they're detained in circumstances that are unsafe, that literally threatens their life. So prior to coronavirus, we were still concerned about the conditions of detention, but this just sort of amps up the level of concern by making it all the more clear that injustices can actually translate into fatalities too often.
Can you talk about some specific examples of the issues that you've been dealing with and they've become sort of urgent in recent days?
Sure. So I guess I would say, maybe I would say also to go back to what I was just saying, those are just sort of the short-term impacts of coronavirus. But of course, we anticipate that there are long-term impacts as well as the result of, for example, all the economic devastation that we're seeing and probably the likely slashing in public funding for many things. So there'll probably be multiple waves of human rights concerns. But in this first wave of the immediate short-term, a lot of the work, at least in immigrant rights enforcement, has been focused on, well, actually not only in immigrant rights enforcement, but I was going to also say in concerns about mass incarceration and conditions of incarceration also for U.S. citizens has been focused on concerns about how do you protect the safety of those who are incarcerated in congregate environments. Congregate just meaning a lot of people concentrated in a small space. And the Center for Human Rights actually released a report not last week, but the week before about medical conditions at the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma, where many immigrants and asylum seekers are incarcerated. And our findings there were based on data that came from before the coronavirus, before the eruption of coronavirus, but nonetheless showed that the medical care received in the facility was in many ways substandard in regular times, right? Not in times of pandemic. And that makes it very concerning if under regular circumstances, the facility was unable to respond effectively to so many of its inmates' needs. What are we looking at when those needs may be literally the difference between life and death, and when we have so little information about what's being done by the facility to safeguard their inmates? So the concern there is that in these settings, you can't have social distancing because people are simply crowded into small amounts of space. They're sleeping, just a matter of 3 feet or sometimes less from another inmate. And there's concerns that the facilities are not implementing testing on a widespread scale, and instead they're saying that they segregate inmates when they are shown to show symptoms of the virus. But as we know, a lot of people who have the virus are asymptomatic. And so there's a lot of reason to believe that if the virus gets into facilities like the Northwest Detention Center, and most of us think it's kind of a matter of time before that happens, that it'll spread like wildfire because the folks in there have a poor diet. They're not accessing top quality medical care. Many of them have underlying conditions, and so it's kind of a worst case scenario. In fact, a recent report by doctors who actually work for ICE inspecting these facilities called it a tinderbox scenario. And really, that's not entirely different from the situation that we have in jails and prisons here in Washington state for US citizens as well. It's a basic fact in any place where you have a lot of people concentrated in very small living spaces and provide them very little access to medical care or good nutrition or good other things that we know support health. So in human rights terms, then these questions that have long been concerns suddenly become emergency concerns. And like I said before, life and death situations. Well, the declaration of a public health emergency does give policymakers and courts, for example, some tools to perhaps respond with the sense of urgency that the situation merits, for example, by releasing inmates when it's possible to do so. So far, I would say that the response we've seen from the authorities to those openings or those possibilities has been tepid at best. It seems that oftentimes both the courts and public officials, including, for example, Governor Inslee, tend to defer to the state when the state says, oh, these are dangerous inmates, or there's a security concern here. And they're reluctant, therefore, to release people. And I suppose that that's understandable, but I wish that those folks would read some of the human rights reporting that we and many other organizations have done, which shows that those kinds of terms about how dangerous criminals are being housed in these facilities is oftentimes really more about fear-mongering than anything reflecting the actual public safety risk that a given individual poses. In fact, it's that under the guise of protecting public safety that many human rights abuses happen. So in the time now that we need to take these concerns all the more seriously, we also need to be all the more skeptical about the way people are being branded as dangerous criminals in ways that literally lead to their death.
So I want to just maybe step back a little bit, and I know a lot of your work at the center has been student-centered. Our students have really been very centrally involved in many of the research that you've been doing there. Can you say a few things about how you see the pedagogical value of this kinds of hands-on work as part of a student's education in international studies?
Yes, I absolutely agree that students are absolutely central to what we do. We wouldn't be able to do any of our research without the students, who are the ones really turning the crank that makes the machine that generates research go. And that's because the research itself is so time-consuming and meticulous that there's no way one person could ever do it, even a small group of faculty would never be able to do it on our own. But I think not only do we rely on them very heavily, but it's also very useful for them, as you said, for pedagogical purposes, because it gives them really a chance to go beyond what they're learning in books and classrooms, or deepen into the actual real world manifestations of these broad trends that we expose them to in the classroom. And I think the students that we've had the chance to work with, we have the wonderful privilege of we have many more students interested in working at the center than we have the ability to accept. And so we're able to pick really outstanding and highly motivated students. And what they have shared with me over the years is just what a difference it makes to be able to go to class and hear and understand, the broad history of trends in incarceration in the United States or something like that. But then come to the center after class and actually read a particular file of a given incarcerated individual and see how these long-term trends or these bigger theoretical questions manifest themselves in real-world questions. So not only to see that finer grained detail of the trends that we talk about as social scientists, but also then to have a chance to do something about it. So too often I think students are being taught about oftentimes really discouraging things or injustices or things that cry out for action. And at the university, sometimes there's not a ton of ways for them to get involved in posing solutions or looking at real policies or things like that. So that's what we try to do at the center, both give them a chance to drill down and understand what's really happening, and then give them a chance also to forge out of that knowledge possible solutions, or at least inform the public about what's going on in a way that's not usually done. So we're very grateful to the work our students do, and we believe very much in this kind of hands-on pedagogy.
Can you also perhaps talk about how this sort of shapes a different understanding of international studies? As you know, different institutions approach studying the world in different ways. This, of course, is a unique way of looking at this. And on the one hand, you're looking at issues that are very close, proximity-wise, physically to our lives. But of course, this has a lot of implications for how we understand the world. Can you talk about that a little bit, that connection?
Sure. I would say that in our globalized world today, we need to understand international studies as not only the realm of foreign policy, but also the realm of domestic policy on issues like immigration and so many other things, right? If we're looking about solutions to climate change, we need to understand the intersection between what states and governments do close to home and what they do far away. The same way access to water, and so many things. And in this particular area that we're speaking about, immigrant rights, it's really kind of almost impossible to separate, because when we give the example before of how when we're drilling down, like looking at the situation of an individual inmate, let's say, or a person who's detained at the Northwest Detention Center, well, the prospect of their rapid deportation is shaped by what country they are from and what bilateral treaties exist between the United States and, or bilateral agreements, I should say, between the United States and that country about the repatriation of nationals of that country. Also situations on the ground in that country. And in some countries, for example, one of the countries where I've done a lot of work is El Salvador, where there's this issue of migration is so prominent in national politics that it even influences national elections in that country, the relationship with the United States and with Salvadoran Americans living in the U.S. So you can't really separate out the international from the local when you're looking especially at something like immigration. But I would actually say that in our world of globalized trade and environment and all these things, that's certainly not unique to immigration. It's part of understanding the way the world works today.
Thank you. Let me just, I asked this for all of our participants in this series about their thoughts about how do you think this will affect the world, this period, this unusual period that we're going through? What kind of lasting effects do you think we will be faced with?
Well, I find it, I don't know if this is just a reflection of my mental health or what, but my reaction to this oscillates dramatically from day to day. So there's many days when I think, this is really this crisis is laying bare a lot of long-term problems, and hopefully that growing awareness of those long-term problems might enable us collectively as a community, both here locally, but also nationally and globally, to think of more creative solutions rather than continuing to deny realities that have been really clear for a long time, but that are now even clearer. So sometimes I'm optimistic, but then other times it's just sort of overwhelming the potential negatives and the fear that this generates about, for example, the slowly detonating, or not even that slowly detonating economic effects of what's happening are enormous. As somebody who I study Central America most closely, and have been looking at some of the reactions of Central American governments, which are tilting towards authoritarian responses to this situation in ways that are really worrisome, because that's a region that had only recently emerged from a really dark period of authoritarian rule that included, genocides and civil wars. So it's hard to know which of those two poles we're more likely to veer towards. I'm not sure. I feel like it's just too early to tell, unfortunately.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Godoy, for your work at the Human Rights Center and your continuing dedication, commitment to these very important issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure.